Tak já se ještě zeptám pana přednášejícího, na jakým jazykem budeme dneska mluvit.
Mně je to jedno. Jak chcete vy?
Já nevím. Jak chcete?
Ta prezentace je v angličtině.
Tak máme mluvit anglicky.
Okay.
So I would like to welcome you for our Monday seminar. The topic today is a linguistic topic from the previous meetings. So I would like to welcome Sláma from the Institute of Czech Language. We are happy you have accepted the invitation, and the topic of the talk today, construction grammar and the description of Czech word formation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello everyone, and thanks for having me, obviously. As you have probably figured out by now, this is a topic about word formation and construction grammar, which is kind of predictable from the title, so that's that. To give this some structure, this is roughly the structure I would like to follow. So there will be some introductory remarks, why I do this, and so on and so forth. I will talk about the traditional approach to Czech word formation, and then I will talk about some problems with it, which kind of led me to try to look for alternatives. Then I will mention some very basic characteristics of this alternative framework, and you will have figured out that that's construction grammar. I will talk very briefly about the evidence from cognitive science for construction grammar in word formation, but this will be rather brief because that could benefit a very, very long discussion because there is a lot of evidence to discuss from psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, and so on and so forth. Then I will focus, which is kind of the second half of this, on the evidence from Czech word formation in particular, and then I will try to draw some conclusions. So first of all, last year in the journal Naše řeč, a review by Lukáš Zádrapa was published. It was a review of a book on the history of word formation of Czech. And I think that this is a passage from that review that is worth mentioning. It's kind of longish, but I think it's really worth reading. The review was kind of incendiary in a way, so it might be a bit controversial, but I think that this passage kind of captures faithfully, albeit a bit poignantly, the reality. It basically says in this passage in bold that Dokulil's theory of word formation has obviously been very influential, and it kind of has the monopoly in the Czech linguistics and word formation. But even though this is the case, maybe we could try think about how, you know, linguistics or linguists worldwide have come up with various other alternative frameworks, because, you know, there is no point in pretending that no linguist in the past like 60 or 70 years has come up with anything in any way, maybe a bit more adequate or something like that. So I think that this is a really good point of departure, although it might be a bit controversial for some people, except that that concerns maybe other parts of the review. But I think, yeah, this is a good place to start. As for the background, I think it's worth saying that I believe in cognitive linguistics. Now, in the Czech context, this might mean different things for different people. For instance, you might have heard of the research on jazykový obraz světa, which has often gone under the heading of cognitive linguistics. But for me, that is very, very far from cognitive linguistics. Because for me, cognitive linguistics is defined by the cognitive commitment, which basically tells you that when you study language, you should take into account what you know about the mind and the brain from other disciplines, as well as some subfields of linguistics, because obviously language is a cognitive phenomenon. And some people have argued, like Butler, that if you take, you know, the functionalist and functionalist linguistics seriously, you should really take into account the cognitive aspect of language as well, because otherwise it's not like fully functionalist according to this scholar. And this seems a bit random, but it will, come in place in the end. I think it's very important to mention a distinction that is very essential for me, but maybe not so emphasized in Czech word formation. That is the distinction between reproduction and production of words. Now, obviously, if you want to focus on word formation and how people use word formation today, it's very important to look at how people produce words rather than reproduce words. And this might be controversial for some people, because then I can go on and say that if you have a word like učitel, teacher in Czech, that word is very frequent. That word is not entirely predictable in that its semantics is not entirely predictable from its form. And so I can claim that based on these facts, this word has to be stored as one whole in your mental lexicon. Now, this might be problematic for some people, but I think if you take into account the psycholinguistic evidence, this is the most likely scenario. It's not very likely that if you want to say učitel, you actually compose that word from morphemes. So in other words, you don't actually produce that word, you just reproduce it as a whole, not produce it as something combined from multiple morphemes. This might be controversial, so that's why I've included a few references, which quite clearly show studying a huge number of languages that some derived words, like učitel, as well as word forms like učitelé, teachers, have to actually be stored in your mental lexicon. If you look at all of these experiments, and there is much, much more of those, there are some results that are not exactly possible to explain in any other way than those words or word forms being stored in your mental lexicon. So that is one of the basics of my approach, and that will be very important, even though this is often glossed over in word formation research. One of its consequences is that if you take this distinction, seriously, you end up focusing mainly on neologisms and hapax legomena, aka the words that appear exactly once in a corpus. And this shouldn't be surprising, because in some older works in the Czech Republic as well as the Slovak Republic, you find this. Similarly, if you look at the monograph of Vlasta Straková from 1985, who is kind of a half-forgotten scholar, even though her word formation research was very interesting. She says basically the same thing. If you want to study word formation, you should focus on neologisms and hapax legomena, because these words are not burdened with lexicalization and all these frequency effects. This means that methodologically, I focus mainly on the data from corpora, where I get the hapax legomena, and from the database of neologisms called Neomat, which is literally neologický materiál. This might be controversial for some people. In the Czech context, it's very often to say that we have this core and we have this periphery. And since something is at the periphery, for instance, neologisms, we don't really have to care, which is nice, I guess. But what it means is that you exclude a lot of data, which are actually, as I have tried to explain, quite essential. And so what you see often in linguistics is that people, first of all, based on their intuitions, tell you that something is peripheral, which probably means that you don't have to care, which is problematic. So for me, I don't really care about core periphery, because I think that, and again, you could quote a lot of researchers that say basically the same thing, especially in cognitive linguistics. The thing is that the peripheral elements of language rely on the very same principles as the core elements of language. So I don't really think that periphery is a valid counter-argument against using neologisms, hapax legomena, and words that are not established, because on the contrary, I think that those are the only words that actually reflect word formation as it is used words produced rather than reproduced. Hopefully that makes sense. So very briefly, you will probably be familiar with the traditional approach. Obviously, the works of Miloš Dokulil are very often quoted. And by the way, we went to the same high school with Miloš Dokulil at different times, but still the same school in Czech. Yeah, so you can see that the traditional approach is onomasiological, which is something very often associated with Dokulil, even though there are other onomasiological approaches. And that already tells you something. Onomasiological means that you start with the content and you go to the form. In other words, psycholinguistically, you focus on the production rather than comprehension, which is kind of characteristic of some older approaches to language. But that might already tell you something about my problems with this approach, because, you know, it just looks at half of the story if you look at it, you know, seriously. Then obviously the approach is morpheme-based. The so-called formante, which I call in English formatives, mostly correspond to morphemes. So if you take the word less, which means forest, and you want to create the diminutive, you add eek, which is a morpheme, and you end up with less eek. So one morpheme is the formative. So this is a morpheme-based approach, and formative is a very important notion that I will keep coming back to. Also, you can see that this approach, the traditional approach, is couched within the structuralist hierarchical model of language and within the dictionary and grammar model, which I think is important to say explicitly. And also it's lexicalist in that it believes that word formation is sort of a separate module of language, whatever that might mean. And it's also input-oriented rather than output-oriented, which basically means that you focus a lot on which morpheme combines with what. You focus on the input a lot. I will show some examples that show this clearly, hopefully. Now, as I've mentioned before, I do have some problems with this traditional approach. I do believe that all of these characteristics that I just mentioned can be challenged and they can be contested, and it can be done in a very nice way. If you were interested, it's the second chapter of my PhD thesis, which will be hopefully finished next year. Here, I will just focus on the notion of morpheme because it's kind of convenient, and you know, I can't really go through all of those problems. As for the morphemes, some problems with the morpheme as a descriptive construct were identified very early. So for instance, Hockett 1947 would be like a classic reference. If you look at more recent publications like Anderson and Bauer, you can see very nice overviews of all the problems with morphemes. I will mention just three. The thing about the morpheme is that if you define it as something that takes form and that takes meaning and associates the two, and it does so repeatedly in a language, aka morpheme is something that is repeated across multiple words in the language, it's kind of problematic to work with a lot of, as Czech linguistics does, zero morphemes, which actually don't have any form. And so based on the definition, they should not really classify or qualify as morphemes because they simply don't fulfill the definitional criteria. The same goes for empty morphemes, which are the opposite in a way because they don't have any meaning. Sometimes people try to say that they do have function, right? But that doesn't quite solve the problem because in like punctuation also has a function, but we don't see punctuation marks as morphemes. And then we have cranberry morphemes like cran itself. You can find some of those in Czech as well. And those fail to qualify as morphemes, even though they are morphemes, because they are not repeated in the language. So for instance, it's kind of clear on analogy that berry is a morpheme in English. And so cran, we are left with cran as a morpheme, but it's nowhere else in no other word in English. So is it really a morpheme if it doesn't, you know, fulfill the criterion of kind of like repeated use across many words? And then a fun example is čtyřčlenný. You can, for instance, find that in the new and nový encyklopedický slovník češtiny, where it is claimed that this word contains a zero empty morph. So we have a morpheme that is supposed to have a form and a meaning, but it has neither. So it leaves us in this ridiculous situation where we define morphemes in certain ways, but there are a lot of morphemes which actually don't fulfill those criteria. And for instance, with zero morphemes, you can find a lot of literature abroad mainly that focuses on the critique of zero morphemes and so on and so forth. And you could talk about that for a very, very long time, but I'm not going to do that here. But hopefully this should give you the idea that some of these basic notions are perhaps a bit problematic if we actually want to look at language as it is actually used, not at some sort of imaginary, beautiful, elegant, symmetric system in your head, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the actual language. Then we should also mention this. There are some other problems with the morpheme. If you look at the empirical research across many areas of linguistics, especially recent research, you can see that many people reject the notion of the morpheme as something that just, doesn't hold up or cannot really be squared with the empirical evidence. So you can see discriminative linguists, computational linguists, and mainly psycho and neuro-linguists basically rejecting the idea of morpheme. For instance, Alice Blumenthal-Drame, in her study, it's probably the most extensive neuro-linguistic study of word formation that there is, concludes that morphemes are basically, like, it's impossible for morphemes to be the basic entities of word formation in our brains, actually. And she says that these entities might considerably overlap with morphemes, but they hardly ever coincide. And we can definitely talk about units of word formation that are either kind of higher or lower in granularity, and I will explain that later when I talk about constructions, that are much closer to what we actually have in our heads in order to be able to use words and to do word formation. So again, this is just to show you that there are some problems that we don't talk about often enough. Now, what is the alternative? My choice would be the usage-based construction grammar, which is a framework which kind of plays on the polysemy of the word construction, because construction grammar is about taking construction as the basic unit of language, but it's also about construction in the eventive sense. It's about the construction of the linguistic system within the speaker on the basis of usage and cognitive factors in general. So construction grammarians are also interested a lot, for instance, in language acquisition, in how your linguistic system develops throughout your life, basically given the usage. So one of the core beliefs of the usage-based approach is that there is no fixed linguistic system. Every single one of us has like some sort of internal linguistic system that is constantly transformed by every single instance of language use. And so what is this construction? Construction is basically a sign. So that's why we have the picture, because it's a pairing of form and meaning. But also it's a learned sign, something that we have to learn. So hence the focus on language acquisition as well. And it's something conventionalized, typically. Conventionalized meaning, across the society. But from slightly different perspective, construction is also a hypothesis about what the speaker knows about the language. So hopefully this will make sense when I give some examples. There are some examples here. First of all, it should be obvious when I say constructions are signs that words and morphemes like cat are constructions because they are learned pairings of form and meaning. But also things like kick the bucket in spite of and the die is cast would count as constructions because again, they are signs and they have to be learned. Then we have partially schematic constructions. If you look at something like the more, the merrier, the bigger, the better, the more you know, the more you don't know, it's obvious that in some way those examples have something in common formally as well as semantically. And so we could say that those three examples are the so-called instances of one underlying construction that again has some very general form and some general meaning. The same goes for these two examples. Harley slept her way through college. I just cried my way to the dentist. You can again see that those examples have something in common, both formally, including obviously the possessive and the lexical unit way, but also semantically. So again, we could say that those two examples are two instances of one construction, which is partially schematic in that it does have a fixed part, namely the possessive plus way, but it also has some schematic part. If you take it a bit further, you could say that, for instance, the passive is a construction, or you could say that there are argument structure constructions. So for instance, if you look at these three examples, again, you can see clearly that they have something in common formally as well as semantically. And so in the construction grammar literature, they would count as three instances of the so-called caused motion construction. And there is a lot of literature on argument structure constructions, and there is a lot of experimental support for the fact that argument structure constructions actually exist, meaning support from language acquisition, psycholinguistics, and so on and so forth. One thing to mention here maybe is that, for instance, sneeze is typically used as an intransitive noun. Verb, sorry. In this example, it's obviously not used intransitively. So construction grammar folks would tell you that you actually combine the verb with this caused motion construction, and the caused motion construction contributes those two arguments that the verbs normally doesn't have. So that's kind of the basics of the approach. Hopefully it makes some sense. There is one other important thing about constructions, and now I start moving towards Czech. If you look, for instance, at expressions like je to pro mě chlap s velkým ch, which is literally something like a guy with a capital G, you find things like that in Czech. You can have something like herečka s velkým H, actress with a capital A, pan režisér s velkým P, Mr. Director with a capital M, and so on and so forth. I looked at those things. You can find a lot of instances in corpora. So I looked at some 4,000 examples of this in a corpus. I also did some like a questionnaire with some 300 people responding to the questionnaire. And I did this study that will be published in summer based on this. But why am I saying that? The thing is that if you look at this construction, is very interesting in that clearly it has some conventional form. So we always have this noun or maybe two nouns. Then you have s velkým, marginally s větším nebo or s největším. Then this construction is associated with a meaning. So it always means something like, you know, a very good specimen of the category. So chlap s velkým ch is like a really good dude or something. Pragmatically, it's associated with very strong positive evaluation. But then interestingly, when you have a look at syntax, it actually turns out that this construction, this is a very typical use, because this construction is very often associated with the subject complement, you know, syntactic slot, aka jmenná část přísudku. And from the point of view of discourse and information structure, instances of the construction are very often rematic or discourse new. So sometimes there are in subtitles, but very typically they are in contexts like this at the end of the sentence, and very typically they are rematic. And you can again show with corpus data as well as the questionnaire data that any of this or none of this follows from the individual words. Those are very clearly the properties of the construction as a whole. So this example shows you that constructions basically put together all the information from all the relevant linguistic modules like morphology, syntax, semantics. So they are these holistic representations. So you basically don't really distinguish, morphology, semantics, syntax, and so on, because it all goes together. And you don't really claim that those traditional disciplines are distinct modules in your brain or whatever. So again, hopefully that makes some sort of sense. Now, how has this been applied to morphology or word formation? Most importantly, you can see something entitled Construction Morphology on the basis of this monograph, which was published some 10 years ago. But you can also see the so-called theory of relational morphology. And those two are very close and very hard to distinguish. So they are basically one theory. So I'll treat them as if they were one theory, because they are very constructionist in their spirit and they are very similar. And the authors contribute with each other or like cooperate with each other. So it's like more like, two sides of the same coin, more like one theory. The basic argument here again would be that on the basis of words like acceptable, affordable, believable, and so on, the speaker extracts some sort of generalization. And for instance, Herz-Boy captures this generalization like this. So this shows you the form. You have a transitive verb, able, it's an adjective. And here you can see the meaning. So he, talks about morphological schemata or schemas like this, which basically correspond to constructions because, again, you have a form, you have a meaning. So if you take this idea and apply it to Czech, what happens is that if you have words like učitel, teacher, cvičitel, trainer, and so on and so forth, again, it's very obvious that on the basis of these individual words, you can arrive at some generalizations. So these words will always end in tel, they will be masculine, they will be animate, and they will be of the declension type muž, inevitably. That's always the case. They will prototypically have the agentive semantics, and they will prototypically be productively formed from the infinitive stem. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that the traditional approach is input-oriented, which means that you pay a lot of attention to what morpheme goes where, what you combine, and so on. If you do this with these examples, you end up in a lot of trouble because, for instance, with spotřebitel, you don't actually have the base verb spotřebit. With nakladatel, the base verb nakládat actually means something completely different. Ředitel, the base verb is not ředit, but řídit. So you have all these problems associated with this. Buditel is not necessarily derived from budit in the sense of wake up, even though there might be some semantic relation, and so on and so forth. So if you have an input-oriented approach like the Czech one, you suddenly have a problem and you have a lot of them. On the other hand, if you apply an output-oriented approach, like the one of usage-based construction grammar, you acknowledge that these words cannot ever be actually produced. They have to be reproduced. From a usage-based perspective, that means that we don't actually produce words like that. I mean, these very specific examples. We don't actually produce them by combining some morphemes. We actually have to learn them as wholes and have them stored in our mental lexicon. That's something that's very hard to contest because all of those words are in some way unpredictable. So you can't really, produce them today. But still, even though they are just reproduced, you can still derive some generalizations. And again, you could go into cognitive science and find a lot of literature about how the brain does that. So we could go there, but I didn't go there in this presentation. But if you're interested, I can go there. It's very interesting. So you can see what I did. From the usage-based perspective, we have these exemplars stored in our memory as wholes. So these aren't actually that much interesting from the point of view of word formation. They might be interesting if you study lexicon and lexical relations, but from the point of view word formation, these are sort of irrelevant for me. But then you can form some generalizations, aka constructions, and you can use those constructions to form new words, those neologisms and hapax legomena and things like that. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully it's apparent what I mean by input-oriented, aka problematic, and output-oriented, aka maybe better. Yeah. Then 2 years ago, or maybe 3 already, Dagmar Diviak, who is one of the major figures of the usage-based approach, published this book, which, by the way, mentions this, which is exactly what I'm trying to say, that from the usage-based point of view, complex words are first unanalyzable exemplars. They are not, concatenations of morphemes. They are, first of all, unanalyzed exemplars. And so morphemes are not really the point of departure. They are more like the result of the process from the point of view of the speaker, as well as from the point of view of the linguist. What I mean by this, to show you one example from language acquisition. This is obviously mirrored by language acquisition. Children don't learn morphemes first. They learn words first. These are some diminutives, which actually, maybe surprisingly, very often appear on psycholinguistic lists of the first words that Czech children learn. So if you have words like Ježeček, píseček, domeček, and so on, the thing is that traditionally you would assume that they just have this morpheme ek, and that's sort of it. But from the usage-based point of view, this is not the case at all. From the usage-based point of view, what probably happens is that the child first derives some generalization like this. So you have something plus eček, and it has some meaning associated with it. But then you have words like nočníček, kyblíček, koníček, and so you derive something like this, not that morpheme. And you might go on generalizing more and more, and you might get here, and you might eventually get here, but you might not necessarily. So some speakers might get there, some speakers might not. And so this starts showing you what is different when you apply the usage-based construction grammar logic, because suddenly you don't have one morpheme and a neat description, but you might have multiple constructions that are somehow overlapping, and that might get messy. But still, to my best knowledge, this is very consistent with the language acquisition literature. There's a lot of literature on how children learn grammatical patterns like this. These are some very famous studies, and it mostly corresponds to this. Now you might think, and surprisingly, linguists often do think that's cute, but we don't really care about children, right? But actually something very similar happens with adults. If you look at words like these, in the neology literature, there is a consensus that if you have borrowings like user-friendly, client-friendly, and so on, these are borrowed as a whole. So if, I don't know, a couple of decades ago, I don't know, user-friendly was borrowed into Czech, it was basically one morpheme. But then if you borrow client-friendly, eco-friendly, people start obviously noticing the patterns. And we have some evidence that people do notice the patterns because obviously they can extract the construction and apply it creatively. So we have words attested like dement-friendly, děcka-friendly, encoast-friendly, and so on. And we even have things like širší veřejnosti-friendly or veřejný prostor-friendly, which again shows you quite clearly that at least some speakers have known these borrowings and they have extracted the schema and they have, or construction, and they have applied it creatively. So this shows you basically the same thing as language acquisition, and it shows you what the usage-based approach exactly predicts. Right. I have this more complex example, but I will skip it and then I can come back to it, even though it's very interesting and it breaks my heart, but time is limited. I will just mention this also, and it's become hopefully kind of obvious that I do this a lot. I rely a lot on cognitive science. But then if you want to dig deeper, these might be good places to start. For instance, generally, the claims of relational morphology and construction morphology are hugely compatible with what we know about the lexicon, about word formation from psycholinguistics. This might be a good overview. Similarly, what I've been talking about those words stored in your memory, and then some creation of constructions on basis of those words stored in your memory is largely compatible with what we know generally about the memory, about the hippocampus, and so on and so forth. And then, for instance, one more specific example, if you looked, and I won't do that in this presentation, although it breaks my heart once again. If you looked at what the construction grammar approach predicts about compounds, you would find out that it's, again, surprisingly compatible with the psycholinguistic research, on compounds, as well as neurolinguistic research on the patients with aphasia and with some types of dementia about compounds. So again, that's just for you to see that I'm not making this up, but this is, again, kind of attempted to be couched within what we know about the language, which goes back to that cognitive commitment that I mentioned. Right, now some specific arguments based on the Czech data. You might have seen this list in the abstract, so I won't read it now because that would be stupid because you can see it, but I'll just jump in. It's very, very painfully obvious. And we've already seen examples that, for instance, if you take nouns with tel, they inevitably are of the masculine animate gender, and they belong to the muž declension type. This is actually very common for suffixes of nouns. It also happens with adjectives. If you look at these adjectives, again, you can see that they have something in common formally, but also semantically. But what is also part of their form is that they inevitably belong to the declension type mladý. On the other hand, it's not caused by the L phonetically or something, because you can see other adjectives ending in li, which actually belong to the declension type jarní. Further examples can be found with verbs. So for instance, denominal verbs kind of by default belong to certain conjugation verb type. And then if you look at some specific examples like diminutive verbs, which apparently exist in Czech, you can see that, for instance, these would always belong to the type dělat, and these would always belong to the type kupovat, and they are surprisingly actually productive and definitely not limited to the children's speech as you would be led to believe, because some things don't quite belong to the child's world. Why am I saying that? First of all, obviously, all of these things that I just mentioned, the speakers of Czech must know. If you know words like čurinkat and so on and so forth, you just know that they belong to the type dělat. If you know any words ending in tel, you just know that they belong to the type muž. And I'm saying no in the implicit sense. So we have implicit memory, explicit memory being, for instance, that the current president of the Czech Republic is Miloš Zeman. That's in my explicit memory because I can recall it and say it to you. But then mostly things that we can do, including speaking, are in our implicit memory. So all speakers that know these words know that they belong to certain morphological types. And that's very trivial. But then if you look at the traditional account, the traditional word formation, you don't really find any explanations of this. Like, how is this possible that affixes are associated with certain morphological behavior? They might appeal to some rules, I guess, but this is problematic for various reasons that I don't have time to discuss. On the other hand, constructions are claimed to be, these holistic representations. So if you posit these affixes as constructions, it's only natural that those inflectional behavior specifications are part of those constructions. And so it logically follows that there are these interactions between derivation and inflection. Another thing, which might be even more trivial and at the same time even more complicated, speakers of Czech just know that tel is used at the end of words. On the other hand, things like velko in compounds is used at the beginning of words. And you can see that very clearly in corpus data if you need that. We could claim that that's because tel is stored in the mental lexicon as a suffix. So obviously it's at the end of the words. But then if you look at things like velk, which should be stored in the mental lexicon as the adjective velký, that word cannot in any way include any specification as being a prefix or suffix because it's neither. So you have this serious question, how do the speakers know that? How do they know that in compounds, velký is usually the first member of the compound? And you also have a psycholinguistic literature that tells you the very same thing, that speakers don't just know parts of words, but they also know where in which position they come. So how do you know that? Again, the traditional account cannot really explain that, because if you take something like víno and braní, put it together, there is primarily no major reason why braní should always be at the end of the word. On the other hand, if you look at it from the constructionist view, you would claim that braní and this are two different constructions. And so if you have a construction like this, it's not surprising at all that braní comes at the end of the word, not anywhere else, even though hypothetically it could come as the first member of the compound. And so the positional boundness of word formation units follows logically from this. Now you might be questioning, how do I support the claim that there is a construction like this in Czech? So the answer is the next thing. If you look at compounds in Czech, like auto půjčovna, if you know the words auto and půjčovna and you don't know the word auto půjčovna, you might be very much be able to figure out what it means. Because auto půjčovna is kind of formed on a productive pattern, its meaning is kind of predictable, so no problem there. On the other hand, we have words like vinobraní, trnkobraní. Those are trnky, in case you wondered like me. You have all these words that are surprisingly productive in Czech. However, the problem is that if you look just at braní, it actually does not have this meaning of like some sort of festival or whatever you name it. And it actually has a negative semantic prosody, meaning that it's typically used in contexts about taking drugs, taking illegal money from someone, taking, how do you say that? Like holding hostages, so taking rukojmí and so on and so forth. So that word is actually used only in the eventive sense, like literally taking something. And so you might question, if these words like vinobraní and so on are productive, how come they all have the same meaning? The constructionist answer would be, once again, that braní as this and braní and as the construction are actually different constructions. And all those properties, especially the fest or festival meaning, is associated with the construction as a whole, with this construction. On the other hand, the traditional approach basically just predicts that you take vino and you take braní and you just put them together, but it fails to explain how come that braní is always at the end. That's not clear. And it also, and that's I think major here, fails to explain the meaning, where it comes from. On the other hand, the constructionist account says that the meaning is associated with the construction. And so it's obvious that if the words are productive, they all have the same meaning because the meaning follows from the construction. So hopefully that is clear and makes sense. Now, there are also some word formation processes which you actually cannot describe from the point of view of the traditional word formation because they simply don't work with morphemes or something like that. One example would be circumfixation, and there is a brilliant study by František Čermák published in 2008, which is very much compatible with my claims, and we will see one passage from that text at the very end of the presentation. But then there are also processes like reduplication, blending, and truncation, aka mechanické krácení, which you cannot really describe using morphemes. So, for instance, reduplication. It's not officially, but traditionally seen as a word formation strategy, and it's traditionally not seen as something that we do in Czech, but we actually do that in Czech. So here you have an example, jste obklopení absolutní tmou, absolute darkness, jako tmou tmou, which is literally darkness, darkness. And this, if you know the cross-linguistic literature about reduplication, won't surprise you because reduplication is very often associated with intensive meanings like this. So we might have something like that in Czech. And then we also have this contrastive reduplication, which is again something very common across languages. In a Romanian forest, someone says, hele, tamhle je kočka, look, there is a cat. And someone says, jako kočka kočka nebo nějaká divoká? Meaning there is a contrast between like a normal, like a kitty cat and like a wild cat. So that's why it's called contrastive. And you use that. I have a lot of examples collected. So for instance, já jsem si představovala nějakýho profesora jako fakt opravdovýho profesora. And there is even one example in the spoken corpus of Czech, in which práce means like a legit job rather than a part-time brigada or stint or something like that. Again, just to show you that I'm not making this up and it's not just my idiolect or whatever. You might know Ladislav Zibura, who is kind of like a famous-ish traveler, blogger, you name it. And he actually posted on Facebook about that, which is great, 2 years ago. And he has some examples, but what is, I'm not showing you for you to read through it and enjoy that, but just, you know, I'm not making this up. But what is interesting is the comments, because some people obviously say that, you know, they don't know that construction, mně to přijde na hlavu. Some people say, ale tam taky hraje roli intonace, so some other things might be relevant for a linguist. And some other people predictably say, oh yeah, I know that, I use that, whatever. So this is just to show you that people actually do that, and I'm not making this up. Another example is truncation. And obviously the point of reduplication was that you can't really describe that process with reference to morphemes, right? Because there is some obvious regularity, so you can describe it with constructions, but not with morphemes. With truncation, if you have things like criminal becoming crim, autobus becoming bus, that's truncation. You just kind of clip the word and you have a shorter word. But in Czech, this is often associated with some sort of affixation. You can see some examples here, bezďák, biják, časák, vesťák, and so on and so forth. If you look at the Velká akademická gramatika spisovné češtiny, something very typical happens. We can't describe this with morphemes only, so we say it's kind of random. So we say that speakers just cut the word somewhere based on their fancy or something like that. And we can't really describe it because it's not just about morphemes. But actually, if you look a bit further, these words are actually perfectly regular. And we need to take into account the structure of syllables, which have the onset, nucleus, and coda. So cat, onset would be k, nucleus would be a, and coda would be t. If we take this into account, you can see that the words are actually perfectly predictable. So we always take the first syllable of the original word. So if you have fundamentalista, you take fun. Then you take the onset of its second syllable, which is de. If it's an alveolar plosive, aka t or de, it gets palatalized, so de becomes de, and you just add the suffix. And this is perfectly regular. This applies to many examples that you can find. And once again, it's perfectly regular. So the traditional approach would tell you that this process is basically random and we can't really describe it. The constructional process does not have, the constructionist account does not have a problem with putting morphemes and syllable structure together because, again, we don't really believe in the different modules and stuff like that. And so from the point of view of the constructionist approach, this is not problematic at all. And in this publication, Boy and Aldring show how these processes in English can be very nicely accommodated in the constructionist account. So this might show you that the constructionist account might be, again, a bit more better in some ways than the traditional Czech word formation. Then the very last thing, and I will just mention a couple of examples, is the existence of complex formatives. And there is a lot of examples of that in Czech if you are willing to dig deep enough. One of them would be horko nehorko, heat or no heat. V Paříži se na ulici moc nesvlékejte. You can actually find a lot of examples like that, where you have a word basically reduplicated, but the second time it gets ne. From the point of view of the traditional word formation, yay, we've derived a word using a prefix, and that's that. From the constructionist point of view, it's more complicated than that, because obviously, if you look at this, and if you look at multiple examples, you suddenly see that we have a conventionalized form, as I've said. But what is important is that the form includes the fact that with nouns, they are always in the nominative. You can't really do them in a different case with this meaning, irrespective of. In a different meaning, it's a different construction and you can use a different case. But with this meaning, it's just the nominative case. And also Sobě and Žižková in a recent paper show that this is very productive and it occurs across whole variety of texts, including, for instance, administrative texts. Again, the traditional point of view tells you that we have some sort of prefixation, negation, and that's that. The constructionist account tells you that this whole thing corresponding to all of this is a construction, It's a productive construction, and the prefixation is just like a byproduct of the whole thing. And that's what connects all these complex formatives. Something that would usually be taken as the main thing in the traditional word formation is just a part of a more complex construction, which I think it kind of shows clearly for me that you should focus on the construction first, because otherwise you're going to miss some very important facts about how language is used. So it's not just morphemes, but it's about complex formatives, aka construction first, because then the word formation operation is just part of the construction. Another example of my favorite would be something like this. Klárov není pro dílo vhodný, protože tam bude přepomníkováno, which is hard to translate, but means something like, you know, you can't use or put this memorial at Klárov because there is already way too many memorials. So that's what this means. And again, some people have said that what happens here is that you get a new verb with the prefix pře, but what actually happens is that you have this complex construction that includes this obligatory, it's always there, the obligatory locative modification. It always includes the verb and it includes this form. Again, you can see that some recent research has shown that it's very productive. And also, interestingly, other forms of this word are hardly ever attested. So it doesn't really make sense to say that if you have přepomníkováno, you've just formed the verb přepomníkovat, because you haven't. You just formed the form přepomníkováno, and other forms of that are hardly ever attested. So for a haired boy and his construction morphology, this would be an example of construction-specific morphology that for him is a very clear argument for a constructionist approach to word formation. So hopefully that makes sense. And one last thing I want to mention is that this also concerns examples. In Czech, I call those prefixálně-valenční konstrukce because they involve prefixes and valency, surprisingly not much. If you look at this, vydýchat na skle kolečko, you might notice that the base verb dýchat doesn't really have a direct object, but suddenly you use vy in the sense of create something, and it does have a direct object, and it's actually a very productive pattern. And Zuzana Lehoučková in 2010 says about this, that if you take seriously the traditional definition of formant, aka formative, you actually must conclude that the valency position is part of the formative. So that's what she does, and she says that the prefix plus the valency position, the schematic valency position, form one formative. And that's basically the whole point here. And I'm just going to show you some further examples where it's, I think, very clear that this is what happens. Again, if you have something like číst knihu, you can form učíst se or učíste k smrti, which is kind of the opposite situation. Here you have a direct object. Here, boom, you don't really have a direct object. So the construction suppresses the direct object, which is something that happens in other constructions like the de-agentive construction. And again, this construction consisting of the prefix and the reflexive morpheme and the suppression of the valency position forms basically one construction that is very productive. It also concerns the aspect and so on and so forth. So again, there is a whole bundle of features that are associated with this one construction. Some other examples would be this, for instance. Again, verbs like beat or bullet don't really take a direct object, but boom, you have the prefix and they do. And the direct object has a very specific semantics. So either it's some kind of money, amount of money, or it's some time, which might, if you're familiar with that sort of thing, remind you that there is this conceptual metaphor, time is money. We talk about time just like we talk about money. You spend time, you spend money, you waste time, you waste money, which has been famously described as the conceptual metaphor. And this conceptual metaphor is associated with this construction, which consists of the prefix, the aspect change, and the valency position. And together this forms, again, one prefix-valency construction. So again, it's great to focus just on the prefixation like the traditional Czech word formation would do, but it's not enough. You have to focus on the whole construction. Again, this is, the same argument over again. There is one last example. You can say things like prozdravit se náměstím, prorvali se k barpultu, and so on and so forth, which is actually rather productive. And again, you can see that there are some formal commonalities, including an obligatory free modification, and including aspect change. And this whole bundle of formal properties is associated with two very specific meanings. In these two examples, you see that someone is literally moving somewhere by doing this. And then you also have fictive motion when someone is kind of metaphorically moving by doing this towards this. So hopefully it makes sense. Again, you have some formal properties, you have some semantic properties associated with the construction as a whole. So my basic argument here is that it's not that interesting to say that, there is prefixation going on and that's that, or there is circumfixation going on and that's that, because the formative is actually much more complex. And I think that for me shows, that construction grammar would be a good way to describe that in Czech. So this is just a summary of these 5 arguments based on Czech data. We probably don't have to go through that again. I can skip this. I wanted to mention this. What are the differences between morphemes and constructions then? First, we have seen that constructions are much more complex. So for me, construction can be something like X, the diminutive example, what was it? Píseček, kyblíček, and so on. So you can have X eček or X eček, and that is associated with a specific meaning, and that can be construction. But obviously, from the point of view of the traditional morpheme-based approach, that would correspond to multiple morphemes. One example that I skipped would be that you could actually make an argument for there being a construction like this, in which you take something and associate it with oložka. This, from the point of view of the traditional approach, would be some 4 morphemes. For me, I don't really care. It's just one construction. So you can see that constructions might be more complex, but there is also for me this important conceptual difference because morphemes are basically just descriptive meta-linguistic construct, and a priori inventory of morphemes is kind of presupposed. On the other hand, no a priori inventory of constructions is presupposed because it's usage-based, and what you find in the usage, that's what you find. You don't really work with any like pre-given concepts like morpheme and stuff like that. Yeah, and so since this is kind of like work in progress, it's not entirely clear how much morphemes and constructions overlap or whether they do at all, but you might get some ideas based on this and based on the examples. And the very last thing I wanted to mention was this. It's a quote, a very long one, from the paper by František Čermák. That paper concerns circumfixation, but I think that this passage very nicely says some of the things that I've been saying, and it's very nicely compatible with the constructionist account. Most importantly, it shows you that the traditional approach in Czech linguistics is still somehow like compositional, kind of diachronically oriented, and it focuses on how things like izovatelný can be divided into these minimal signs, aka morphemes. So for instance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 morphemes here. But he actually says that if we look at it from a slightly different perspective, we might as well say that izovatelný is just one whole, because it is this one formal thing associated with a specific meaning. And that's kind of what I've been saying. So I wanted to conclude with this passage because I think that the paper by František Čermák is actually surprisingly compatible with the constructionist view of language. And I think that's kind of it. Hopefully it's not too confusing or whatever. And thank you for any remarks and comments and critique and whatever. Thank you.